Philip Goff. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Miles. It's great to be here. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
So I've heard that you're a panpsychist. What is panpsychism?
Panpsychism is the view that consciousness goes all the way down to the fundamental building blocks of the physical universe. So it's a question for physicists what those things are. Let's say they're fundamental particles for the sake of discussion. Well, then the panpsychist view would be those fundamental particles have very, very simple forms of conscious experience, and that the very complex conscious experience of the human or animal brain is somehow derived or built up from those simpler forms of consciousness at the level of fundamental physics. It's a basic idea. It sounds a bit strange, but I think there's a lot to be said in its favour.
I think the first question that people ask, if only implicitly, is like, if this is true, if everything or every fundamental bit of things has consciousness, why do we assume it doesn't? I mean, this point is hard to phrase in a non-question begging way, but why does it not seem like that's the case? I mean, if we talk about other macroscopic objects like a cup or a table or a coffee machine, in some way we can see that they aren't conscious. But I don't know that the situation is much different if you present me with a quark or an electron. Not that I've ever seen it directly, so it's different. But yet that seems wrong. Why does it seem like these things aren't conscious, if they are?
Well, just to clarify a possible a common misunderstanding of the view, panpsychism isn't necessarily the view that literally everything is conscious. The basic commitment is that the fundamental building blocks, maybe particles, maybe fields, are conscious, but it doesn't mean every random combination of conscious particles is itself conscious. So this table isn't conscious, it's just made up of conscious things. Why don't they see... Well, as you say, you can't really be... We don't have any visual contact with a particle. I suppose maybe part of it, it's an interesting question, part of it might be that they are so simple in behavior. And sometimes when we're talking about consciousness, it is a bit of an ambiguous word, and sometimes people use it to mean something very sophisticated like self-consciousness, or we're thinking of very kind of sophisticated psychology. But the way I use it, which I think is common among both scientists and philosophers at the moment, it just means subjective experience. So that can come in very complicated forms in human beings, but it's simpler in sheep, simpler in voles. We had a vole come into our house today that I think our cat chased in. We tried to rescue it. Don't know where it went. It's controversial how far down the animal kingdom consciousness goes. Do flies have subjective experience? Do bed bugs? There doesn't seem any conceptual limit to how simple it could go. So the thought is not that an electron has very complicated feelings of existential angst or something. It's just that it has very, very rudimentary forms of experience. So clarifying that can sometimes undo certain icky feelings people have about panpsychism. I guess it's partly just cultural fashions as well. But finally, just very finally, part of the reason, maybe we could go into this or maybe not, part of the reason this has been getting so fashionable is, more fashionable than it used to be at least, is that rediscovery of important work from Bertrand Russell but from the 1920s, and his starting point was just that actually physics doesn't really tell us very much about what matter is. It just gives us its kind of abstract mathematical structure. And so I think we have this kind of illusion that physics is giving us a richer story than it is, that we sort of understand in some sense what stars and planets and big bangs are, that we have some grasp of their substance, and maybe that positive grasp seems incompatible with mentality. But, well, this kind of came up in my recent debate with William Lane Craig, I think he had that sense that, no, we know what matter is, and it rules out consciousness. But actually, I think Russell was dead right that it's the other way around. Actually, it's consciousness we understand by being conscious, and we don't really know, at least from physics, we don't really know what the hell matter is. So there's nothing from science we know about it that rules out its being conscious, and it's perhaps the illusion that science gives us more substance of matter than it does that gives us a bit of ucky feelings about panpsychism.
So is this the idea that science tells us what matter does rather than what matter is? I mean, is that the line of distinction to draw?
That's one way of putting it. That's the way I put it in my book, Galileo's Error. The way I've been putting it in my new book I'm just finishing up this summer, I think, physics just gives us mathematical structure. So in a sense, you can think about it as physics is sort of giving us software that could be realized in lots of different types of hardware in principle. I mean, basically, here's a vivid way of making the point. In principle, if you had enough people on walkie-talkies communicating to each other with very simple signals, they could realize the structures of physics. I mean, you'd have to have as many people as there are particles in the universe, but they could in principle do that. And then you think, well, that wouldn't be physics. That wouldn't be stars and planets and black holes. Well, in a sense it would, because that's all physics is telling us, mathematical structure, software. And so you could in principle realize that with people talking on walkie-talkies, and that would capture everything physics has to tell us about matter. So I think that's a really nice, I hope that's a more, I remember trying to explain this to Joe Rogan, he'd know what the hell I was talking about. Maybe that's a more vivid way of capturing Russell's insight that in an important way, physics isn't really telling us what matter is. And so then the panpsychist thinks, well, if people on walkie-talkies could realize the structure of physics, maybe interactions of simple conscious things could also realize the structure of physics. And so that points the way to how you can get physics out of some underlying story about consciousness. I don't think you can get consciousness out of physics, but I think Russell showed how you can get physics out of consciousness.
So something that's always confused me about what panpsychism asserts is two different ways you might formulate the idea. You might say that there are these fundamental particles and they also have conscious properties. And so just like I am a physical being and so on, some construals of the mental and the physical, I'm a physical being and I have physical properties, but I also have mental properties. And you might say the same thing about a fundamental particle. It's a physical thing in the way that we usually mean, whatever that means, but it has mental properties of some kind or another. But then you might say, and I've heard some panpsychists say this, that's not actually the view. Rather, what we mean is that particles themselves are forms of consciousness, and that's it. There's not like this thing, the particle, that's defined and identifiable independent of consciousness. Rather, the particle itself, in just some sense, is experience, is consciousness. I understand the first view. I don't understand the second view. I don't know what that means.
Well, I think it certainly is the second form, at least this Bertrand Russell inspired kind of panpsychism that is currently a bit more fashionable. Yes, and I mean, this is a misunderstanding I talked about in my last book, Why the Purpose of the Universe, this misunderstanding of the view by the physicist Sabine Hossenfelder. She was interpreting it in that first option you just laid out there, that particles have physical properties, mass, spin, and charge, and consciousness properties. And Hossenfelder points out quite rightly, well, they'd show up in our physics, wouldn't they? They'd show up in our experiments. I remember that. And they haven't done. Yeah. So yeah, I don't think that's the view that's popular at the moment, or more popular than it used to be. Still a minority view. So let me try and help you make sense of this. Well, I guess I would just go back to what I was saying earlier, that all physics gives us is mathematical structure, software. So it's an open question what the hardware is that realizes that. Maybe it's people on walkie-talkies, but the panpsychist says, well, look, maybe there's these very simple conscious entities interacting in simple, predictable ways through their realizations. Through their interactions, they make certain patterns, certain structures. And then the thought is, well, those mathematical structures just are what we call physics. So these things we call particles and fields, physics, come back to the other way you put it, physics really just tells us what they do. Physics tells us what an electron does. It is silent on what an electron is. So panpsychism sort of fills that gap with consciousness. It's so think about, like, what does physics tell us about electron mass, charge? They're just defined in terms of behavior, you know. Charge is about attraction or repulsion, opposites attract, like charges repel. Mass is about resisting acceleration and gravitational attraction. It's just telling you what it does. It's like, physics is like playing chess when you don't know what the pieces are made of. You know, you just know what they do. Okay? Well, panpsychism is filling in what they're made of as well as what they do. Well, no, it's not as well as what they do. Physicists tell us what they do. We're adding a metaphysical interpretation, if you like, of the substance that is doing what physics is telling us it is doing.
So let's dive into that example. Is the proposal then that charge, spin, mass, would you say that those are three different types of experience at base, and that's what lies behind the behavior, and they somehow come together in one fundamental particle?
Yeah, that would be the standard way of interpreting it. Maybe, you know, panpsychists could have slightly different views on this, but yeah, that is the standard way of understanding the view. I mean, there's a couple of different ways you could spell this out. I don't want to get into too much technicality, but I mean, what is mass? How are we defining mass? Maybe mass is just the dispositional property, the doing property. And maybe you could say, well, that's not itself the consciousness property, but it's grounded in what we sometimes call a categorical property. So some people think, you know, dispositional properties must be grounded in categorical properties, and then the panpsychist will say, well, it's consciousness that's the categorical property.
Sure.
Or maybe mass is a categorical property that we're picking out, to use the jargon if there are philosophers listening, rigidly designating in terms of what it does. So we might be picking something out, you know, physics is saying it's this property that we characterize by what it does. In that case,
okay,
mass just is a form of consciousness. That's probably, if you're not done much academic philosophy, that's probably a little bit too much techie details. But yeah, roughly the point is, yeah, mass, spin, charge, these are different properties. Physics just tells us what they do, but in their intrinsic nature, as it's sometimes put, their nature that goes beyond what they do, they are forms of consciousness, very simple forms of consciousness.
Right. Okay. Well, one more question just about the view, and then I want to ask you about its motivations. Why would we ever affirm a thesis like this? I'm going to edit this part out, but I lost my key pivotal penetrating. How does panpsychism differ from what we call idealism in the philosophy jargon, where idealism is, I take it, if you think of physicalism as the view that the physical world is all there is, physical things is all there is, and the mental either supervenes on or is dependent upon the physical. Dualism would then affirm that there is this robust mental thing and physical thing. And then idealism comes along and says, well, there's just no physical things. All there is the mental. And that can sometimes take a theistic form where everything is just a thought in the mind of God. Either way, how would you intelligibly differentiate panpsychism from idealism? Do we need to? Does it matter?
I mean, it depends how you define each of these terms. If by idealism you simply mean fundamental reality is entirely mental, then panpsychism, or at least pure forms of panpsychism, will be forms of idealism. But often idealism can mean a view on which the physical world is maybe not real or less fundamental. I mean, George Berkeley's classic view where at the fundamental level we've just got minds, humans, animals, the mind of God, and then a table is sort of a collection of ideas in those minds.
Yes.
So that would be not a form of panpsychism, because panpsychism is more committed to the view that, at least as it's standardly understood, that the physical reality is fundamental. The physical universe is fundamental, particles, fields. It's just that its nature is consciousness. So it's, in a way you might think of it as sort of a little bit closer to physicalism in that regard. That's why some people like it. There are also some panpsychists would say that there's more to the particle than just its consciousness. So that's not quite the view that, it's got its physical properties and its consciousness properties. Its physical properties are filled out by consciousness and some broader nature that goes beyond pure consciousness. So you have a sort of impure version of panpsychism. So maybe in that regard, maybe think of it as a Venn diagram. You've got idealist views like Berkeley's that are not panpsychist, impure forms of panpsychism that are not idealism, because there's more than just the mental at the fundamental level. Mm-hmm. But there's also overlap, right, where we've got sort of pure forms of panpsychism are forms of idealism, at least if all you mean by idealism is the fundamental level is purely mental.
So that is helpful. But then why would anyone want to affirm this view? I think emphasizing this kind of structuralism about scientific explanation opens up the door for panpsychism as a live explanatory option. But it doesn't by itself give us a reason to affirm it over other views. Why should we affirm panpsychism? What does it offer us?
Yeah, God knows. Good point. No, I suppose the fundamental starting point for me, and the thing I'm much more confident on actually than panpsychism, is the falsity of physicalism, the more mainstream option. Although, anti-physicalism is a significant minority. It's, in the Phil Paper survey, physicalism was, 52%, as opposed to 32% who oppose it, and then the others can't make their mind up. But anyway, so yeah, that's the starting point. Is I just think, I feel very confident, in fact, that it's not just that we haven't yet got a physical explanation of consciousness. Most people agree on that. But and not just that we've never even made any progress on that. We haven't managed. It's not like, we're nearly there. We haven't managed to explain a single conscious experience in terms of patterns of neural firings, whatever. But more than that, I just think the whole project is kind of incoherent, maybe in a subtle way, but it is incoherent. Like, there are all sorts of arguments that press towards this, the knowledge argument, the zombie argument, and so on. The way I'm pressing it now, again, this is how I'm putting it in this new book, tell me if you think this is clearer, is just that, look, you have to think about what physics is in the business of. Physics is great. Physical science is great. But what is it all about? I would say it's all about explaining behavior, explaining observable behavior. I like to give the example of phase change of water, right? Let's say from ice to liquid. Physical science gives a very satisfying explanation of that. But what are we trying to explain when we explain that? We're trying to explain the behavior of this stuff, right? Going from being very rigid when it's ice, solid. When the temperature goes up, it becomes more flexible, fills the container it's in, becomes gas, it goes all over the place. It's all about behavior. And we explain that in terms of underlying behavior of molecules, right? When they're in rigid lattice structures or when they become, the hydrogen bonds get weaker. Explaining macro level behavior in terms of simpler form behavior. You could go deeper into atoms, subatomic particles, and so on. That's what it's all about. It's wonderful, but that's what it does. And I think when we're trying to explain consciousness, I don't think that's what we're trying to do. If I'm trying to say, why does my wife feel pain? I'm not trying to. That's not in itself a question about her behavior or the behavior of her inner parts. It's a behavior. It's a question about how she feels, and that's a very different kind of question. There's very close relationships, of course, between behavior and feelings. Still, when you ask, why is this system have feelings? That is not a question about its behavior. So it's just not the sort of question physics is in the business of dealing with. It's a bit like saying, very finally, telescopes are brilliant. Let's apply them in pure mathematics. Oh, no, it's just a totally different explanatory project. So that's one way into it. Obviously, it's a huge debate.
I liked what you said in your book, Why, which I will plug right now. Slight tangent. I thought was a fantastic book. It was really, really good. It was rare for its both clarity and rigor as a philosophical text, but I could tell that it was intended for a wider audience, and I think that it hit the mark. So good work, Philip. That was a good book.
Oh, that's very kind of you.
Of course.
Right, we'll finish the project now. You've done the nice compliment. We'll leave it there. Thank you. Good night.
We'll leave it there. I liked what you said, though, that physicists and scientists generally do routinely postulate unobserved or unobservable objects or phenomena in order to explain the things that we see. And so it's not the issue isn't the unobservability of consciousness per se, that we can't get it under a microscope and see it. It's that in this case, it's the thing we're trying to explain which is unobservable.
Yeah.
Whereas in the other case, you have like observable experimental data you're looking at, and then you postulate, say, atoms or electrons or unobservable fundamental particles. Here, it's actually the thing to be explained that we can't get under a microscope to look at. And that's what the fundamental distinction is. And I'd never heard the point put that way. I thought, that's very perspicuous. That seems right. Is that still your view?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, look, that's one good way of showing why this is utterly unique as a science. It's not just another scientific problem. Look, for much of the 20th century, people it was a taboo to talk about consciousness. It wasn't serious science. From the 1990s, people are starting to think, oh yeah, this is a serious scientific problem. We need a science of consciousness. I think what we're still, at least as a broad scientific community, including philosophy, I hope, we're still not fully on board with this, is the philosophical underpinnings of this problem. It's not just another scientific problem. That's one way of pointing to it, that it's not publicly observable, and it's something we are trying to explain. Whereas in other cases, scientists theorize about unobservable things to explain what we can observe. In this case,
right,
the thing we are trying to explain is unobservable. That's one way of getting at it. Also, I talk in the Galileo's Error book and the Why book, and my other book, actually. I always keep coming back to this point. I think people think science is done in a vacuum. You just do the experiments and get the results. But science is always done against philosophical assumptions, and the ones we've been operating with for the last 400 years were designed largely by Galileo, and they were explicitly set up to put consciousness outside of the domain of science, because Galileo wanted science to be purely quantitative, mathematical, whereas consciousness seemed to involve all these qualities, colours, sounds, smells, tastes, but he didn't quite put it in terms of consciousness. But I think that's effectively what this was getting at. So actually, maybe you can edit that out, because that makes it sound a bit more off target than it was.
Sorry, disconnected. Are you still there?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Okay.
I was just saying, maybe edit out where I said he didn't talk about consciousness, because I think people will think it's. So maybe I could say, so Galileo wanted science to be purely quantitative, purely mathematical, whereas in consciousness we seem to find these qualities, colours, sounds, smells, and tastes that you just can't really capture in the purely quantitative language of mathematical science. So I think look, there's all sorts of ways of getting at that. This isn't just another phenomenon. I apologise, ungrammatical error there. And ultimately, it's something we need to explain that we know about independent of experiments, right? All the rest of science, your starting point is these experiments, these observations. Now, consciousness, we didn't find it down a particle collider or under a microscope. We know about consciousness by being conscious, by being immediately aware of these feelings and experiences. So, it's just this is what I'm most passionate about. We need to get to first base by just acknowledging this is very, very different from a normal scientific issue. And I don't think we're quite there yet, but hopefully getting there.
How does this tie into panpsychism, though? So we have here the failure of the scientific paradigm or scientific type explanation to account for consciousness. I'll grant you that. Give it right to you. What does panpsychism offer in terms of an explanation of consciousness that would be superior to alternatives?
Well, consciousness is real, and the physical world is real, I think. And they're closely connected. I mean, that's what science does reveal to us. That is a scientific task, to show that there are close connections between kinds of brain activity and kinds of feelings and experiences. And we need to make sense of that. What is going on in reality to tie consciousness and the physical world so closely together? And I don't think you can answer that with an experiment, because consciousness is not publicly observable. You're not going to answer that with an experiment. What you do with experiments is identify this close connection, right? You can't see consciousness, but you can ask someone what they're experiencing. Sure. You can scan their brains. You can start to establish this close connection. But ultimately, we want to say, what's going on in reality to undergird that close connection? And we just got to look at the different options. One is dualism, that consciousness and physical reality are these radically different things, but there's maybe some special laws of nature tying them together. That's what David Chalmers is famous for thinking. He postulates these psychophysical laws. So consciousness and the brain are just really different, but there are these special laws of nature tying them together. That's one option. An option I take very seriously, actually. But I think panpsychism is a simpler option, right? That there's just consciousness at the fundamental level, and physical reality emerges from these more fundamental forms of consciousness. So that's more attractive because it's simpler. And as scientists and philosophers, we try to respect Occam's razor. We try to have the most simple, elegant, unified theory of the data. And I think panpsychism looks to do the job. So if we just think about the three options: physicalism, dualism, panpsychism. These are three different explanations of how come what is going on in reality to tie consciousness and physical reality together in this tight way. Physicalism, I think, is incoherent. Dualism is a coherent possibility, but it's a bit complicated, a bit inelegant. Panpsychism is coherent, simple, elegant, unified. It's looks to be the best bet. I'd still say, if you want my sort of credence, which is philosopher's term, as you know, for a degree of belief, I think I'm very, very confident that physicalism is false. Maybe like 90%. In terms of with panpsychism true, probably just maybe like 60% or something. I do think it's the most probable bet because I think it's the simplest, but it might not be true. Dualism might be true, or what's sometimes called panpsychism, that there's something else underlying the mathematical structures of physics that's neither consciousness nor the stuff physical science talks about. It's maybe something like proto-consciousness or some third element we have no grip on. That's a possibility as well, although it seems to me to be sort of going for mystery when there's no obvious motivation. But I take that option very seriously. So, yeah, you've just got to... It's not like as I say, it's not like a normal... Because consciousness is not publicly observable, we can't sort of totally pin this down with an experiment. But So we just have to go for the simplest theory compatible with the data. And I think that's what panpsychism is.
What do our terms here mean? Because I'm getting a bit confused about what physical is supposed to mean. It seems to me that one could say the following, that panpsychists are a species of physicalists. They are physicalists in that they affirm that the physical world is all there is, but rather they think that the ultimate physical constituents are consciousness. So how do you differentiate? What does a physicalist mean when they say physical? It seems to me that you're affirming that physical things are real. It's just you're disagreeing about their fundamental nature. So that you could still qualify as a physicalist, it's just hard to define these terms.
It's a very good point. Yeah, the big chapter of my academic book, Consciousness and Fundamental Reality, pictured here, which is in beautiful paperback now. It was going to be. So I've got this big chapter in that on what is physicalism? How the heck do we define this word? I used to say how the hell, but because of kids, I say how the heck now to sort of. I say blooming instead of bloody as well. It's fun of my kids, and then I feel really embarrassed. I'm talking to grown-ups and I'm using these childish terms. Anyway,
very sweet.
But David Chalmers said to me, "You can't have the first chapter of your book defining physicalism. That's too boring. So there's a more exciting, sexy first chapter, maybe the Galileo stuff, and then we get to define physicalism. But it is an important issue, and Galen Strawson, very good panpsychist, very good. He's a wonderful writer, Galen Strawson, wonderful at capturing Russell's insight that we don't know what the hell matter is. He was my PhD supervisor, good friend. And but he's very passionate, actually, that, panpsychism is a form of physicalism. What's the physical? It's just this stuff, whatever it is. We point at it, kick it.
Yes.
And so if you define the physical in that way, then it's a form of physicalism. My disagreement with Galen is just, I think that's an unhelpfully liberal definition of physicalism. Not liberal in a political sense. Just, look, Galen's very passionate about that's how we should define it. But look, I think we should define terms in a way that's useful. And I think it's useful to define physicalism so that we get the debate, we get the sides of the debate.
I see.
So very roughly, I would define physicalism as the view that you can entirely capture physical reality in the terms of physical science, these quantitative terms. That doesn't quite do the job, which is why I need that big chapter in my academic book. But for most purposes, that's a roughly. And then you got the debate. So then people like me, the anti-physicalists, say, no, you can never fully explain consciousness in those terms. The other side say you could. So it's just a terminological disagreement. I've got this collection of essays on my work, Is Consciousness Everywhere? Galen did one of those and engaged on this issue of what we should mean by physical. Actually, my first publication ever in 2006 was a volume responding to his work, so it's nice to sort of come full circle 20 years later. Anyway.
Okay, that's helpful. That clears things up. So let me offer to you my best take on what you've said is the most difficult problem for panpsychism as an explanation for consciousness, in that it doesn't really seem all that explanatory. You have consciousness at the fundamental level, say, of fundamental particles, extremely rudimentary forms of experience. Sometimes, I take it that the idea is sometimes when they come together in the right sort of way, like the structure of a brain, you get a much richer form of consciousness, like my conscious awareness, cognition, thought, reflection, emotions, self-awareness. But not every time. A cup, a table, a coffee machine, a cucumber, maybe not quite a cucumber, but other things don't have that conscious experience, even though they're roughly the same physical size. It doesn't seem like panpsychism has any sort of explanation about why it is that one structure, that these things combine in one structure and give rise to consciousness, but not in another. We just kind of have to stipulate that they do. So, back to you, Philip.
Yeah, well, I mean, firstly, to clarify again, some panpsychists do think literally everything is conscious. Usually more reductionist panpsychists like Luke Roloff's. Annika Harris got a popular book on consciousness and sympathetic to panpsychism. I think she thinks literally everything is conscious. But then you'd still have the question, I suppose, what's become known as the combination problem. Well, why are the macro level things conscious? Just because they have conscious parts, why do those conscious parts form a conscious whole? And that's one of the most discussed issues, and there are various very interesting proposals for how to make sense of that. Can we tell some kind of reductionist story where really the universe is just made up of conscious particles, and what we call Miles's mind just is a label for a complex combination of conscious particles? Some panpsychists try to tell very reductionist stories. I mean, on the face of it, it is tricky to make sense of. Our consciousness seems to have such a deep unity.
Yes.
It doesn't seem to be just just like a bunch of complicated conscious particles, involved in complex interactions. It doesn't seem to add up to something that has unified consciousness in its own right. I mean, I'm more sympathetic to a non-reductionist form where essentially we add another primitive, that it's just a fundamental fact that these conscious particles in certain circumstances form unified conscious wholes. And of course, it's going to be a partly scientific question. Maybe the integrated information theory would be one proposal, that when there's more integrated information in the whole than the parts, they form this new conscious unity, and that's just a sort of fundamental fact about our universe. Or maybe these particles have a sort of combinatorial power that kicks in certain circumstances. And now you might say, well, what's the point of being a panpsychist? If you're going to add that primitive, why not just dispense with the conscious particles, just our regular, I was going to say bog standard there. I've discovered that's a term American listeners do not understand. I had this with the philosopher Eric Schwitzgebel, who said, bug standard? What's it got to do with bugs, on my Mind Chat podcast? But let me just say the word regular. Sort of, why not just regular physical particles? And then they have this primitive capacity. So Tim O'Connor, for example, has that kind of view, that, these primitive capacities to make consciousness, particles have these. So he's sort of a dualist, but he doesn't think, consciousness is in the soul, that kind of God adds at conception. He thinks he thinks particles have this special power to make consciousness. So why not go for that? And then I would say, I mean, the as we've already discussed, the core attraction of panpsychism is not so much making consciousness, it's making physical reality. It turns the physicalist project on its head. Rather than starting with matter and trying to get consciousness out, which I think is incoherent, we do it the other way around. We start with consciousness and get matter out. So that's the central explanatory attraction for me. And if we have to add another primitive to get from the simple forms of consciousness to the more complicated forms of consciousness, okay, so be it. I still think we've got quite a simple view, because you've just got one kind of stuff at the bottom of reality. Simpler than dualism. I think that's very attractive.
There is a certain kind of panpsychism which is going to seem a bit at odds with the way we've defined the term panpsychism, and that's cosmopsychism. So, rather than put words into your mouth, what is cosmopsychism, and how does it relate to the more general panpsychist thesis?
Well, early in our conversation, I said it's a question for physicists what fundamental physical entities are. I said for the sake of discussion, let's think of them as particles. But actually, many theoretical physicists are inclined to think of the fundamental building blocks of reality as fields, universe-wide fields rather than particles. And on this view, particles are kind of local excitations in fields. It's the fields that are the basic thing. Well, if you combine that with panpsychism, then the fundamental forms of consciousness will fill out these universe-wide fields. And it looks like that quickly leads to the view that the fundamental conscious entity is the thing that has those fields, the universe itself. So this leads us to cosmopsychism, roughly the view that the universe is conscious. But it's usually not just the view that the universe is conscious, but that it's the fundamental thing. So that our world isn't a sort of Lego brick world made up of little Lego bricks, little conscious particles, if you're a panpsychist. Actually, the fundamental thing is the whole conscious universe, and everything else exists as aspects or derivations of that fundamental conscious unity.
How does the progression work from this whole to parts derivation of consciousness? Like that is to say, I have my conscious experience. I am a conscious subject. And so you might ask, well, how do these fundamental bits of consciousness, fundamental particles, how do they come together to produce this consciousness? But now that's not the right question on this view. Then the question would be, how do you go from this one, I take it, unified consciousness of the universe, how does that get broken up into more discrete conscious subjects like myself? So it's not quite the combination problem, but there's an analog of it, perhaps. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. It's analogous, but I would say it's in some sense exactly the same problem because, yeah, I mean, okay, we've got these conscious particles, but how does that brain as a whole get its consciousness? Likewise, okay, you've got this conscious universe, but how do things like brains that emerge from the conscious universe, how do they end up having their own consciousness? And I think it's the same problem in the sense that we get all the same difficulties. Some people try to tell a very reductionist story. I would be happy with a more primitivist story where you just say, it just does. That's a sort of just fact about our universe. I should say, actually, I've also explored a semi-reductionist view in my paper, How Exactly Does Panpsychism Explain Consciousness? One of my earliest and most cited publications from 2009 was Why Panpsychism Doesn't Help Explain Consciousness. People might be surprised. It was before my conversion to panpsychism. Maybe I was rebelling against my PhD supervisor, Galen Strawson. So I later, many years later, tried to address this in this sequel paper, How Exactly Panpsychism Help Explain Consciousness. And so this semi-reductionist picture is, well, it divides between consciousness, conscious experiences, pleasure, pain, seeing, color, and so on, and the thing that has the conscious experiences, what we sometimes call the subjective experience.
Yes.
The thing that has them. So I tell a sort of reduction, a primitivist story about subjects. We sometimes call them subjects of experience, the things that has consciousness, or the mind, if you like. So it's a primitive fact about our world that new conscious minds emerge in certain circumstances. But then I tell a reductionist story about the consciousness that fills those minds. And I could say, they could just come from fundamental physics, maybe these universe-wide fields. So these new conscious minds emerge, and they are filled with the consciousness that's already there. So I tell a story like that might have some of the attractions of both reductionist and non-reductionist views. But, I'm less and less inclined to think we need to be reductionists. I think it's a sort of, philosophers really worry about this, and I worried about it for a long time. But I just think it's a dogma that physics runs the show. I think a lot of philosophers and a lot of theoretical physicists, I've debated this with Sean Carroll, think, oh yeah, we know empirically physics runs the show, and so everything's reducible to that in some sense. I don't think we know that. I think a lot of our physics is, as Sean agrees, is based on very small numbers of particles. We've no idea whether more complex causal principles kick in at higher levels. We've no idea whether, the Schrödinger equation is perfectly, the Born rule of quantum mechanics is perfectly captured in the complex functioning brain. It's just too complicated. And Sean tells me, oh, well, it would make physics more complicated. Maybe, okay, but maybe that's how reality is, and we need to sort of take more time to work out how to make sense of that. I recently examined a very good PhD by Jonathan Emery. He's now just got the PhD. I co-examined it with Alyssa Ney, very distinguished philosopher of physics, who has no time for dualism or any kind of anti-physicalism. But this was a very impressive PhD arguing there is no empirical argument against dualism. Going into cutting edge neuroscience, going into the stuff Sean Carroll published in my volume Is Consciousness Everywhere, arguing, from physics. It was very, very fascinating thesis saying, how a dualist could deal with all of this. That there really is no empirical case against dualism. So that's why I'm much more open to dualism now, and non-reductionist forms of panpsychism. Still, the reason I'm attracted to a little bit more to panpsychism is because it still seems to be more simple and parsimonious.
So we have this view of the cosmos as a whole, conscious, and you make the point in your Stanford Encyclopedia article that this doesn't mean automatically that we now have pantheism, where you have this agent that is the universe, self-aware, with intention, can do things. Rather, most cosmopsychists, I take it, would say that the consciousness of the universe is still, just like fundamental particles, either extremely rudimentary or just a complex mess that has no coherent unification. There's no sense in which there's this agent here that has a unified consciousness and awareness and cognition. But that's not the view of cosmopsychism that you defend in the context of the fine-tuning argument. So, rather than do what I always do, which is articulate the fine-tuning argument, because that's my area of research, I'm going to ask you, Philip, what is this fine-tuning? And then we will use that as the segue into your proposed explanation for fine-tuning.
Good. So this is all in the last book, Why the Purpose of the Universe. Good, modest title. Well, the fine-tuning of physics for life, I suppose, in the last few decades, it has become clear. This is not fringe controversial physics. As a non-physicist, I wouldn't be defending fringe controversial physics. Although you find a lot of denials on it on social media. Sorry, I'm rambling. Maybe cut that out.
You're good. That's the good stuff, Philip. We like that.
This finding that for life to be possible, certain numbers in physics had to fall in a very, very narrow range of the values they might have had. So I always like to give that's the most perplexing example. Dark energy that powers the accelerating expansion of the universe. We know the strength of that force roughly, and if it had been a little bit stronger, everything would have shot apart so quickly. No two particles would have ever met. We wouldn't have had stars, planets, any kind of structure at all. Whereas if it had been a little bit weaker, it wouldn't have counteracted gravity. Everything would have collapsed back on itself a split second after the Big Bang. So for life to be possible, I mean, it's not like there's one exact unit, but a pretty narrow range that had to fall in. And it's just one case of many. And on the face of it, it looks just wildly improbable that our universe would have had the right numbers for life just by chance. Oh, it's just the way it is, I mean, actually, another example from my new book, actually, I've talked about this a lot. If burglars breaking into a bank and they get the six-digit combination right first time, What do you think they just guessed it? No. It's 1 in a million chance they guessed it. You're going to think there's some other explanation that removes the improbability,
Right.
adds some inside information. Well, that's just 1 in a million chance. A conservative estimate of a conservative estimate of getting the right numbers for life by chance is 1 in 10 to the 136, which is, 1 followed by 136 zeros. So if you're not going to take, 1 in a million as fluke, you certainly shouldn't take 1 times 10 to the 136 as a fluke. So, I think, because it's so abstract, people tend to think, oh, maybe, you hear a lot of people say, oh, maybe it's just luck, But look, that's just not thinking through the probabilities and comparing them to probabilities such as I've just given that we do have some kind of grasp of.
Yes. Well, what's crucial in an inference to design, which I think is a point that's understressed when we just talk about the improbability involved, is that you have to have a antecedently plausible hypothesis that makes the evidence more likely.
Exactly.
So to use your analogy, any 6-digit combination, any specific 6-digit combination would also have a 1 in a million chance of coming up randomly. But if they had flipped just a random set of digits that didn't open the lock, we wouldn't infer anything despite the improbability involved. And why? Well, that's because we have, in the case of the 6 digits that work, an antecedently plausible hypothesis that, they had access to the information from whomever to get the lock combination, which makes it decently likely that they would be able to unlock the lock, that they would know the lock combination. We don't have any sort of hypothesis like that for the other series of 6 digits. So in the case of fine-tuning, I think it's right, we have to emphasize the sheer improbability. But we've also got to propose another hypothesis that makes fine-tuning more likely. Because, if it had the same sheer improbability on a design hypothesis, well, then we wouldn't be able to infer design. So what is the hypothesis on offer that you think makes fine-tuning more likely than just random chance?
Yeah, no, that's a really important point. It's always comparative, isn't it? It's always...
Yes.
And I mean, to give another example that some people often raise, the chances of my birth, my conception, are freakishly improbable. That exact sperm and egg met, and that scares the hell out of me, actually, when I think about my own children, how improbable it was that they came to be, and I love them so much. But in that case, we're fine with the improbability because there's no non-ad hoc hypothesis that would make it less improbable. And you just got to emphasize, for people who are not familiar with this stuff, this isn't just some childish intuition mongering. This is rooted in our standard way of understanding evidence, Bayesian reasoning, and we can get into the details. I know you deal with these in the details, as I try to do as best I can. So I think we're just still stuck in this idea that this sounds a bit goddish, and obviously this is childish intuitions, and it's really not. It's, if anything, I think it's cultural fashions that are causing us to ignorantly ignore this striking data point. Anyway, what is my proposed explanation? Well, I'm open to the God hypothesis. But my problem with that is the familiar one, that I think there's another data. It does fine with fine tuning. We can explain, if there's a God who created the universe, it's much less improbable that we'd have the right numbers for life, because life is a thing of value, and so you could. It's not inevitable that a God's gonna create a universe compatible with value, but it's not wildly improbable. And so that forms an explanation. But I think there's another data point the traditional theistic approach doesn't deal with well, which is suffering. Why the heck would you... Oh, there we go again. Why the hell do we have such horrific suffering if there's a loving, all-powerful designer at the root of it? So anyway, the middle way option I explore in why the purpose of the universe is the universe itself is conscious, Cosmopsychism, and it designed itself. And if the universe is a conscious mind, yeah, maybe it's just got some meaningless consciousness, but maybe in some richer sense it is a kind of agent. It is sensitive to considerations of value, a very different kind of agent to an naturally evolved agent like you or I, but maybe it's a conscious mind, and maybe it has certain goals, and the fine-tuning of physics for life is a reflection of the goals of the conscious universe.
So I think this is a hypothesis that's worth taking seriously. I mean, that's why I'm writing this paper looking at 3 non-theistic explanations for fine-tuning, because I take them seriously. But I have some reservations about how this explanation compares to theism. I think my working thesis in the paper is that for all fine-tuning can tell us, and reasonable considerations about prior probabilities, and even about what happens when we take evil into account, I think it's just a wash. I think that it comes out that I don't see any reason to think that this cosmopsychist hypothesis is any more likely than theism. So I guess I disagree with you in thinking that it's a superior hypothesis to theism. Now, my chief objection is that it's not immediately clear how this form of cosmopsychism, what you call teleological cosmopsychism, the universe is actually an agent, not just possessing this kind of rudimentary conscious experience, but enough of a robust cognition to fine-tune its physics for future goals. I don't see how that avoids the problem of evil, because your objection you encapsulated to theism is that if God is all-powerful and perfectly good, why is there so much evil and suffering? That is disconfirming of the theistic hypothesis. Well, but on the cosmopsychist scheme, the universe is oriented towards the good. I take it that we are to imagine that the universe is sufficiently good so as to prefer good ends and conscious life, a universe with life. That's a good thing, and so it pursues that end. Well, even that hypothesis will lead us to ask, if the universe is oriented towards the good, why is there so much bad in the universe? Now, I know that you have a response to that, and so we'll continue back and forth. But how would you answer that question? If the universe aims towards the good, why is there so much evil and suffering in the world?
Quite simply because I don't think the universe is all-powerful. I mean, it's a question, okay, if the universe is directed towards the good, where do the laws of physics fit into this? And my answer is that the universe is a being that is subject to certain limitations. There's some things it can do, some things it can't do. And the laws of physics on this view map out those limitations. So it's not like the laws of physics, it's not like there's something outside the universe that's constraining it. It's just a fundamental fact that it can do some things and can't do others. And so early in the universe, it had flexibility to, in its directedness towards the good, shape the constant values to be compatible with life. But maybe there's still some flexibility. Who knows? Maybe that's how life came about. That's not something I've said in writing. I'm just throwing that out there as a possibility, not something I'd necessarily want to argue for. But at any rate, it's severely constrained in what the universe is able to do. So I mean, really, there's two things going on here, actually. One is how it deals with evil. And really, in dealing with evil, it's just limiting the designer's powers. So it could be a supernatural, as I said in my debate with William Lane Craig, it could be a supernatural designer to deal with the problem of evil that's just limited. It could be the traditional God in all ways, except it's just limited. Fine. And I actually think what I think is nice is we could go into this maybe. I think you can very precisely give the limitations. Anyway, but there's another attraction to cosmopsychism is parsimony, really. A bit like what I said about dualism, right? Why postulate a supernatural designer when you can just have the universe itself as the designer, right? So it's a more simple hypothesis. So it's those two things going on together. But yes, I very much enjoyed it. But You sent it me last week, or I know you were lucky. I had some insomnia last night, so I read a lot of the paper and I very much enjoyed it. But anyway, let's carry on the argument.
So then what I say then, because I take cognizance of that reply, this is the analog of denying omnipotence to God. It's how you might escape the problem of evil. In a theistic context, you'd say, well, God's not all powerful. He can't prevent all this evil. Okay. I don't think it's enough, though, to say that the universe is only limited by the laws of physics, so that it can't do things which would change the form of the laws of physics. Because it would seem that there are all sorts of things the universe could still do that don't contradict physical laws. So the example I gave is if someone had grabbed my friend Frank and was about to toss him off a cliff, I would run in, stop him, would prevent this evil from happening. But I didn't contradict the laws of physics when I did that. And so if I can do it, well, surely the cosmic agent that is the universe could do that too. Another point I make is surely like a universe where the Holocaust didn't happen is consistent with physics. So I might be misunderstanding the proposal, or we might have to say something more about what it means to say the universe is limited. Maybe it's not just the laws of physics, it's other constraints too. So what do you think?
No, I saw this in your paper, and yes, you're right. Just the limitation of the laws of physics isn't enough. Nice example you gave there. I would say it's not just the laws of physics, though. It's also the initial conditions. I can't remember now actually whether I've been explicit about this in the Wire book and the paper. But anyway, that's how I'm thinking. I've got a paper, a more academic paper. Did the universe design itself, as you know, Miles? This is not necessarily a necessary eternally existent being. Maybe it began at a certain point in history, the Big Bang, and that was just where it started off. Okay, so it's also limited by its initial starting points that it did not choose, and it's got to work from there. So it's the two things together, I'd say, the initial conditions and the laws of physics. I mean, so if that's all deterministic, then it couldn't have done otherwise. Obviously, I'm saying it's not completely deterministic because it has some flexibility, but yeah, the two together rule out a lot of options.
Okay, so you mean the initial conditions that physicists talk about, like the initial condition of the universe, how we started everything off, the ultimate input to the laws of physics. You don't think cosmopsychism can explain those initial conditions, rather it just has to take those as given, as for granted. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. I mean, in the paper, I've explored certain versions of this view where the conscious universe used to be in I'm speaking slightly loosely now by saying used to be, because I mean before space and time, used to be a non-physical thing. So it used to be like the traditional God, and it became a universe. Entered space and time by becoming a universe. William Lane Craig says to me, that doesn't make sense. I say to him, don't you believe in the incarnation? Anyway, so, and you might be led to that form of it. Not just, you're not going to get there if you just go for fine tuning, but suppose you're also impressed by the cosmological argument. You know, you're wondering, there must be a cause of the universe. Well, I suggest, you can keep all the wonderful parsimony of this cosmopsychist view by saying, okay, there was this sort of goddish thing that became a conscious universe. If you're going for that view, then I would say it was limited in which first form it could take when becoming physical. So maybe it had to start from a singularity or something. Okay, but if you're not motivated by cosmological arguments, if you're just dealing with fine tuning, then you might just say, well, look, it's just a contingent being that has a beginning, and it didn't choose that beginning, and it has to do the best it can given that beginning and the constraints of fundamental physics.
So being limited by initial conditions, I'll have to think about whether or not that resolves the issue of less evil, whether it absolves the cosmic agent from accountability for evils that happen later.
Well, you could just trust me that it does.
Right. Philip said it. No, but doesn't that raise a really more fundamental problem, which is if we say the cosmic agent is not in control of initial conditions, then you haven't explained all of the relevant instances of fine tuning, because there are various initial conditions which are appealed to as finely tuned for life, like the amount of entropy in the very early
entropy. Yeah. What did I? Oh, I had a nice chat, a long, interesting conversation with Graham White, a physicist from Southampton, about the entropy issue. Blah, 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 blah. Yeah. I mean, you. Have I thought about how these two things interact? Maybe I need to think a little bit more about this, actually. So you to deal with low entropy, I mean, you might have some other explanation of that. Some physicists have proposed other explanations of the low entropy,
Sure.
and it's a funny one. Low entropy, is it quite a fine tuning thing? It's not like it's
different.
It's not like it's in the narrow band you need for life. Is it? It is a slightly different thing, although it is something which is certainly striking that it somehow needs explanation.
And there might be others of the initial conditions. I'd have to categorize them. But if there are, do you think that your view now, it no longer explains at least every example of fine-tuning?
So if you want to explain low entropy, you'd have to have some prior state which of the universe before that low entropy beginning. Maybe I need to think more actually about would that have to be going into this view where the universe used to be non-physical, used to be more traditionally goddish. I mean, that would be one option, but maybe there could be. I mean, one thing I've done with this stuff is cheekily borrow from multiverse theorists, where they think, building on string theory, there was this early stage of the universe where things are much more in flux, where those the values of the constants were not yet determined, which is why I thought actually part of your paper said it's ad hoc to say there's this time when they weren't determined, but I think that sort of fits with independently what a lot of theoretical physicists entertain. But maybe I just have to think about that and talk to physicists, more importantly, about whether there could be some physical state which is in some sense prior to the low entropy. Actually, there must be for multiverse theorists. I enjoyed the debate. Right. I enjoyed the debate between Roger Penrose and Alan Guth on Phil Halper's channel about So Penrose pushes this low entropy problem against multiverse theorists. I really want to understand if this is a good objection, and it's. I've talked to you have to really know the physics better. And what Guth was saying is, well, no, it's very rare in the universe, in the multiverse. Low entropy, but it's in those circumstances that it's the right initial circumstances for a universe to start. So I could, cheekily borrow something like that there's this pre-entropy stage where the universe has some, flexibility to choose the level of entropy. The difficulty with this I was discussing, it's interesting, isn't it? Difficulty I was discussing with Graham White from Southampton was it's not like the universe is just when you're choosing the level of entropy, you're not just selecting a value, because entropy is sort of supervenes on the arrangement of physical stuff.
Yes.
But I don't want God to be able to arrange all the physical stuff, because then God will be too powerful, we'll be back to the bottom of evil.
Exactly.
So we have to make sense of the universe being able to select its entropy level without fiddling with the matter. And Graham got AI, I think it was ChatGPT, onto this and came up with a good way of framing that in terms of physics. But anyway,
well,
yes. Thank you. You reminded me of this through this conversation. Thank you.
Of course. No, this will be good enough for me in the purposes of my paper to make some new points. So this is good stuff.
Oh, you can attack me more now. I'm hoisted by my own petard. American listeners can Google that fine Shakespearean phrase if you. Anyway,
it's a good one. I think William Lane Craig said that once, and I was like, "What? What does that mean?" I like it.
It's a bog standard Shakespearean phrase I've used.
Right.
I know a bog standard isn't an American term either. Which, Shattered. You don't have shattered either, meaning tired.
We
It's
don't.
very, very common in the UK. Shattered. Anyway,
I like that one though. My UK friends would say that all the time, like, "Oh, I'm shattered." And I'd be like, "I love it." It's like I'm destroyed. I'm so tired. Anyway, so I'd like to end on a. This actually isn't exactly where I want to end, but I'd like to ask you a few big picture questions about how this cosmopsychist worldview relates to ideas about the purpose of the universe. That's the subtitle of your latest book, The Purpose of the Universe. What on this view is the purpose of the universe? And I have a follow-up.
well, certainly it doesn't guarantee any grand future purpose. So I argue that there, in the past to the present moment. Let me start that again. So what I've argued in the Why book is that there is evidence for some kind of goal-directedness in the early universe, some kind of push towards something of value. It could be that that's it, though. It could be that, we've got life now. That's the end of it. That's the best the universe could do. It's just going to be heat death from now on. Well, not from now on, at some point in the far-flung future. On the other hand, you might think, well, if there is purpose and goal-directedness in the universe, it'd be sort of improbable that, we happen to be living at the final culmination. So one could perhaps have some tentative hope that there's something more going on. There's something more to come that we don't fully grasp yet. That's as far as I go in the Why book. After the book came out, I have publicly come out as a quote-unquote heretical Christian, and I've embraced a slightly non-standard form of Christianity, but actually the core of it is what ordinary Eastern Orthodox Christians believe, which is roughly that the purpose of existence is for God and us and perhaps the entire physical universe to come into a more unified state of being. They call this theosis or divinization. They think we will ultimately share in God's form of existence. We won't become God, but we will share in God's form of existence. So yeah, it's, I'd encourage people to check out Eastern Christianity, which is very different to Western Christianity, much less emphasis on sin. There's none of this Protestant idea that it's all about God wanting someone to punish for our sins, which I always thought like that's what Christianity is. It's only recently I've discovered. I know like the Protestant reformers kind of invented that 500 years ago, and Eastern Orthodox Christianity, which is obviously much, much earlier, it's all about this God and the universe becoming one business. So I actually came to think, not only does this kind of resonate with me spiritually, but I actually think it fits quite well with this God of limited abilities. So my understanding, my version of Christianity is, God's on the way to making a perfect universe, but just can't do it like straight away. Can only do it by creating a kind of crappy universe and slowly starting to become one with it, and that will eventually get rid of the imperfections and make it wonderful. So it's not. This is the core of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, but it's a heretical version. I'm an Anglican, I love the liberal flexibility of Anglicanism. So it involves, for example, the God of limited powers, a slightly non-standard view of the resurrection. So I found my home in the marriage of the mysticism of Eastern Christianity and the liberal flexibility of the Anglican Church, Episcopal Church in the US, as you call it. Anyway, so that's the view I've embraced. I don't know whether it's true. I think it's very uncertain, but I think if it resonates with me spiritually, fits with my deeper spiritual experiences. I think it fits with this God of limited powers that I do think there is strong evidence for. So that's the cosmic hope I have faith in, I live in hope of, and I've found happiness, joy, and peace through committing to live in hope of that. But that's massively going beyond the why book. The why book just says, who knows? But you could have a reasonable hope that there's something more going on. And I'm, happy for people to take that seriously too. That was a very long-winded answer.
Not at all. I didn't think we would get into that. But
let me throw in, this is the new book I'm working on, actually. Sort of a more liberal, mystical, a more liberal, mystical way of engaging with all of the Abrahamic faiths, actually. A more liberal way of engaging with organized religion, and in terms of community structure, tradition, those kind of benefits, and not worrying too much if you're a little bit heretical, if you're very uncertain. Maybe take it all as a big metaphor if you want. That's this book I'm currently working on. Anyway, that was an even more long-winded answer, but go on, you speak now.
Not at all. I can't help but ask you. I've had William Lane Craig on the channel, so at the very least I've met him in that capacity. And what made the debate with him so fascinating was William Lane Craig is not a very liberal thinker in that regard. He is an ardent defender of Orthodox Christianity. And, I mean, it just goes to show what lengths Orthodox will go to. Some see him as critically non-Orthodox in certain respects, but I don't. If I may ask, and you may not want to answer, and I'll cut it out, what was your experience debating him? What was that like?
I thought it was very enjoyable, actually. Yeah, it was spirited. I thought it was spirited but friendly. I thought I knew. I should probably thank Jack Symes, actually, because normally when I approach, another public philosopher people might have come across.
Sure.
Normally when I approach debates, I'm always sort of seeing the other side, and and then Jack was saying that's not how Craig does things, and no. I knew he sort of prepares and he comes for and so I think I gave as good as I got, but I think it was a good spirited debate. I mean, you say he's a defender of orthodoxy, he's a defender of innovation in a way. He's a defender of a form of Christianity that was invented 500 years ago and is popular in the US. I mean, and I did get I wrote a blog post, a Substack post on the discussion that happened afterwards between the podcast host and the producer about, well, Philip's on a journey, and okay, maybe if that's in the spirit, we're all on a journey. But why am I on a journey? Because I'm not defending this form of Christianity that was invented 500 years ago. In fact, I'm defending a core of Christianity, of the Eastern Church, that is much older. And yes, there's other aspects of my view which are novel, but so was the Protestant view that Jesus is being punished for our sins. Nobody had talked about that earlier. That's why every time I see fundamentalist people preaching in the street, this is what I engage them with. Do you know the view you're defending was only invented 500 years ago? Anyway, Eastern Orthodox people come back to the beautiful image of the vine and the branches. Instead, Jesus, I'm the vine, you are the branches. It's this idea that we're going to come into organic unity with Christ. But why was I saying that?
That you're not necessarily on a journey. That this could be the end game, and that's okay. Yeah,
it might be. It might change, but there's Molinism as well. That Craig defends Molinism, which was a great, a radical innovation. When was it? A few hundred years ago or something. So I can't remember when Molina was now. I think this is part of what I'm dealing with in this book. Actually, that we've got this. I think people have this idea that religion is always, old-fashioned and stays the same, and I think it's partly because we're in a period of history where liberals in general doesn't think religion makes intellectual sense, and so it's all the business of conservatives. Not that I hate conservatives. I think in many ways it's a healthy society where you've got a mix of progressives and conservatives. Progressives saying, look, we need to update, and conservatives saying, hold on, let's not throw everything out, But in religion at the moment, it's unbalanced. And whereas I think in history, the great religions have always reinvented themselves, with the science and philosophy of the time. Aquinas was radically new philosophy. The Protestant Reformation reinvented things. So I think, we need to reclaim this spirit of, we can reinvent religion for our time, and maybe there's a core we're still sticking with, and maybe that's part of God's plan. That we're not at the end of the story. We're still rediscovering what it's all about.
Yeah, I find that a lot to agree with there. I don't have any pushback. I mean, I myself have gone through pretty steep reevaluations of my own religious commitments, and I find it refreshing to think that we can think about these things anew. That when you grow up ultra religious, that is not exactly what you're taught. You're not taught that these specific religious commitments, especially in the evangelical American Christian church, you're not taught that these core commitments are up for debate or can change. And so it can be very hard to allow yourself to think these things through and to think that it's not all or nothing. I think is the key point that that's a key mistake a lot of people make, is to think, if I reject this specific belief, the entire worldview has to be jettisoned. We have to become nihilistic atheists. And that's not true.
Exactly. And so, if there are people listening, who are either from a very, very conservative evangelical background and are thinking, I'm skeptical a lot of this, or from a liberal background, maybe raised without religion, and spiritual people who think, they could get something out of the community and the structure of traditional religion. I want to say, and what I'm trying to say with this book is, there are churches that, or synagogues or mosques that would welcome you and embrace that. And, I was saying to my priest that I was getting abuse of being heretical online, and he just laughed and said, I think we're all a bit heretical, aren't we? So, I think the Episcopal Church, certainly the Quakers, but even the Anglican or Episcopal Church, I think there are very evangelical wings, there are very, very more than Catholic wings, but there is a place for where that kind of more nuanced position, it might be entirely orthodox, but be very uncertain if it's true, or it might be taking it all completely metaphorically. And I just think if there was a broader, again, I don't hate conservatives, but if there was a broader demographic returning to traditional religion, I think that would transform the character and invigorate it and have a representative sample of the population on board. I think that'd be very exciting. That's my kind of dream, I think, is to get help liberals make intellectual sense of religion again and see where that leads. It's an experiment.
Well, Philip, as we wrap things up, I just want to say again, I thought your book, Why? The Purpose of the Universe, was excellent. And if your upcoming book is as good as that one, then it will be well worth the read. So thank you for coming on the podcast.
Even better. No, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Maz. It's been a really fun discussion and given me a lot of homework to think about.